Hi everybody, good day to you all. Today, as part of our Redstone 7 interview, we are here with Assistant Professor Lavinia Picollo, and the interview will be conducted by myself, Eldrick, who is one of the editors, as well as our student advisor, Eugene. Both of us have attended Prof. Lavinia's classes before, particularly in meta-ontology 2 semesters ago and logic last semester. So in particular, Eugene was the TA for, I think, the logic module by Prof. Lavinia last semester as well. And Prof. Lavinia is a recent hire for the Philo department at the National University of Singapore, only coming in last year. And before that, she was a lecturer at University College London. She was also a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Advanced Studies and an assistant professor at the Munich Center for Mathematical Philosophy, both at LMU. So she received her PhD in philosophy in 2015, and her research interests are in philosophical logic, formal metaphysics, and the philosophy of logic and mathematics. In particular, she has special interest in reference and content, deflationary conceptions of truth and satisfaction, propositions, properties, classes, and many more. She also has broad interest in ontology, epistemology, philosophy of language, and metaphysics. So without further ado, welcome Prof. Lavinia, and we're gonna start the interview proper. And just as a way of introduction, I guess something casual first. Congratulations on the baby. How's that coming along? And at the same time, how have you been with the COVID outbreak and all?
Oh, thank you very much, Eldrick and Eugene. It's very nice to be interviewed. Well, I mean, I think we've been lucky with the baby because he's quite an easy baby compared to other babies. At the beginning he was sleeping already throughout the night, and he is usually happy and so on. But even then, having a baby is quite disruptive, especially if it's the first one, I think. And of course, work is what happens when the baby doesn't need something urgently, which is not very often. So I think I'm doing fine given the circumstances, but yeah, it's a bit tough. It's a bit tough. But here in Singapore, we have, fortunately, the possibility of having someone helping us and so on. So I can't complain, really. Not in front of other parents.
Right. Yeah, sounds pretty okay, but still all the best with whatever you're having, right? And well, admittedly, it might be a bit too soon, but so far, how do you feel about working in NUS and in particular the NUS philosophy department?
The department I really like. I like teaching the course. I mean, I enjoyed all my courses, even though I must say some of them were more enjoyable than others. But I could see how students were quite engaged. I like the students here. I think they're smart. They're interested in learning and interested in. I think it's more like I would say they're quite interested in philosophy and in learning things, even if they're not going to be tested for that. So it's quite good. I think I'm happy with the department, with the students in the department. And I'm also happy with my colleagues. I think my colleagues are amazing. And I like talking philosophy with them. I like hanging out with them. And we've been doing quite a bit of that recently. So that's very nice. The university is a bit of a bureaucratic monster. So some things are very good. Some other things, I would say, not so much. For instance, I don't have a computer now, so you can see me on the screen and it looks like I have my computer below me. But this is just because it's the iPad. And I don't have any other way of making it look really nice. Maybe I could just put some books and it's a bit difficult. So yeah, and then it takes like 3 or 4 months to get a new computer, even if your budget's been approved way before that. So yeah, I'm struggling a bit, but I'm very happy with my colleagues and students.
Right, yeah, that's a very apt expression of our university, I suppose. So I think before we go on to the philosophical questions proper, I guess just one last sort of personal questions. Why do you choose to pursue a PhD, and I guess any advice for those who are likewise interested?
Well, it was a natural thing to do. Like once you're studying philosophy, at least from my perspective back then, if you wanted to continue on, I mean, the philosophers that I knew were my professors, right? And maybe visitors that we had. And they were all professors at universities. And to be a professor at university, you need a PhD. And so it was the obvious choice. I wanted to be a philosopher. And that decision, I think I made before deciding to do a PhD, right? So the PhD was a no-brainer, right? It was just a step towards the goal. So I guess the question would be like, why did I decide to become a philosopher? And that's a very strange question. Should I answer that, or should I leave it for a later?
Sure. Yeah.
Bit of a,
yeah.
Well, I am not entirely sure. I guess there's a combination of things. So one is that I was never comfortable with the non-abstract. Everything like seemed more like non-abstract things seemed to be abstract things decorated with unnecessary nonsense. So what I needed to do was to get to the bottom of the abstraction. And I thought that was mathematics. And so I thought for a long time I was going to study mathematics. And I did study mathematics, but at some point I realized that mathematics was not abstract enough. It was still about mathematical objects only. And I was, during math class, I would always raise my hand and be like, oh, but what about, for instance, set theory? What about the universal set? Could we have a theory that has a universal set instead of this other theory, which seems to be incomplete? And then this was at university, and professors were not very happy with me. I was always asking these questions. So it was obvious to me that I had to study philosophy. Also, I was trying to study literature, and I always found myself trying to write stories or things like that, where the message was basically a philosophical idea. And so I realized that the common denominator of all these things was philosophy. And I thought, well, this is what I'm interested in, and then I should do it. But this was a very naive choice. And obviously, you're interested in many things. That doesn't mean you should make it your life or your whole career. So my advice to people thinking about doing a PhD or thinking about becoming philosophers is, yes, you should like it, because if you don't like it, if you don't like anything, then the choice should be done in terms of you should consider different factors. Philosophy, I would say, is one of those things that it would be pretty hard to do if you don't like it. But I don't know, because I haven't done much else. So I don't know if there's other things that are, in fact, easier to do if you don't like them. But I think if you like philosophy, there are other considerations. They're very important as well. And those are things like what academia looks like, really. What it would mean to be a philosopher, the pressure, the issues with the job market. You might love doing philosophy, but you might not love writing papers, or you might love writing papers, but you might not like networking and lobbying and things like that. And sadly, academia is just full of that as well. There's a bunch of things you'll have to do that usually don't come together to be a philosopher. So I would, if you're thinking about pursuing a PhD and becoming a philosopher, maybe come talk to one of us at the department or wherever you are, and we can give you more or less a sketch of what the discipline is about, what academia in particular and in this area is about. And then you make your decision, because it's not just about liking philosophy. And also the money, right, which is usually an issue.
Right. Yeah. Thanks for that. I guess now we can sort of move towards the, I guess, more substantive philosophical questions. So, Eugene, perhaps you want to start us off. Yeah.
Sure. I had some questions prepared, but I just want to zoom in on an offhand comment you made. So, I mean, it seemed to me that mathematical objects are abstract objects, par excellence, right? So it was surprising to me that you mentioned that, mathematical objects are not abstract enough. So maybe you could elaborate on that.
Mathematics is not, I mean, abstract, I guess I was using abstract in a non-technical sense, right? In an intuitive sense, what I perceive to be, I guess I use that word because this is how I put it. Those are the terms in which I put the conundrum to myself. Like, what is it that you like? For instance, at school, I would, when I had a physics exam, I would just erase the units and solve the problem and then put them back because I couldn't deal with, what's that, like kgs and things like that. It's horrible. I couldn't, I'm serious. So I always ask myself, okay, what is it? How is it? Everyone was surprised, right? How can you like mathematics and physics? They're so similar. How can you be good at mathematics and so bad at physics? And I think what I told myself was that one of them was applied as opposed to being pure, I guess, is that the technical term, right? But back then I didn't know about it. So I described my situation as liking more abstract things. But yeah, I would say pure. And philosophy is more pure because philosophy is more general in that sense. It's less applied, whereas mathematics is sometimes, somehow, philosophy or logic, depending on where you stand, applied to mathematical objects, and therefore less pure.
Right. Thanks for that. Okay, I'm just going to put you in a spot then. So do abstract objects exist?
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, it's not that I don't know whether they exist. Or at least there's a question that is more fundamental than that. And it's whether the question makes sense. And this is what I don't know. Sometimes I wake up and I feel like fine. And I'm thinking, well, of course it makes sense. Like, I don't know, presumably, if tomorrow we come up with a new mathematical theory about wagagons and that satisfy weird properties, and we're all talking about these things, that, I mean, seems to me that we just made those things up, and obviously these things don't exist, right? But of course, this is exactly what happened with the other theories that we already have, right? Maybe for certain, maybe to serve certain purposes, right? But still, like, oh yeah, there are these things called numbers. One day, one person, but obviously it didn't happen like that. But somehow, and I guess it's somebody erasing the units, right? People were counting land, counting pyramids, and then one day it was like, what if we get rid of the pyramid unit? So then I start thinking, yeah, you're right. Well, then maybe either nothing exists, none of these abstract objects exist, or they exist in this lighter sense. They exist because it's convenient to use them, and in that light sense they exist. And so I oscillate between fine, Carnap, and Quine, and it's very unsettling. I know there are questions coming up regarding that, and I'm very nervous about them. So the answer is I don't know.
No worries. Yeah. It is a bit unfair to ask you questions like this, I think. But yeah, maybe we'll go with some lighter questions first then. So some of my questions prepared are either or questions. So we're trying to figure out who you vibe with. So we're just going to list some people in the history of analytic philosophy, right? And you could just say like either or, right? So, so the first pair is Wittgenstein or More.
Yeah, it's Wittgenstein. I am a bit ashamed, but yeah.
Eldrick's very happy. He's a Wittgensteinian, or he thinks of himself as one. So Wittgenstein or Carnap?
Right. So I guess I have to go with Carnap there. I mean, Carnap is my hero in many ways, so I do vibe with Carnap quite a bit. I appreciate his thoughts on, well, his work on, like, he is the guy that created philosophical logic as we know it, and of course I have to give him every bit of credit for that. I like his pluralism. I like his views on ontology. I like Wittgenstein's views on language. So I think that the comparison is not, this is not going to be a linear order.
Of course, yeah.
So, but I do think that Carnap was much more serious than Wittgenstein overall. I can understand Carnap much better. I think Wittgenstein, I mean, he just left some blanks here and there, so you can fill the blanks and then make it sound exactly as you like, which is very convenient, but it's not analytic philosophy.
Okay, Carnap or Quine?
I think I have the same issue here. Well, one of the issues is that I'm not sure about the views in ontology because I oscillate between them. So that's one thing. I like Carnap's conventionalism, so to speak, and I don't like Quine's critiques. I don't agree with it. So I side with Carnap there. And probably I side more with Carnap regarding his views on ontology than with Quine. I'm not pro this like view on this continuous view between science and mathematics and logic. I don't buy the picture. I think that mathematics and logic have much many other things to say besides the application to science. But I do love Quine for his deflationism. So I've been really inspired by Quine. And I do like Quine on ontology criteria. I like Quine on no entity without identity. I mean, all of these people belong to the same tradition, if you ask me, right? So I'm happy with all of them in a way. But if we look into details, there'll be little differences here and there. So overall, I think I would say Carnap. But only by
I still have two more names prepared.
Go for it, yeah.
So Carnap or Russell?
Carnap.
All right, and then Carnap or Frege?
You know, it's very unfair. I cannot choose between Carnap or Frege. I mean,
yeah, it's a bit cheap.
it's Frege is such a genius in many ways. I love, so his philosophy of language is very decent, but this is not why I like him. I think I like his this is a big thinker, right? He was thinking about the big picture and he had a big program that failed, but I do like the neo-Fregeans and the recent work. For instance, Crispin Wright or Bob Hale. I'm kind of in love with the idea of having deriving arithmetic from logic alone. And I think also Frege was a great inspiration for deflationism about truth. His use of higher order logic is great. I'm really interested in higher order metaphysics. I was actually thinking maybe it would be interesting to give a course on that. Then I remembered that I think students here don't really love metaphysics. So yeah. So I think Frege takes things more seriously than Carnot, and for that I'll have to choose Carnot.
Okay. Well, we've come to the end of this small list that I prepared. So the winner is Carnot. But I was wondering if there were any other standout figures in the history of, well, the history of philosophy in general that you were interested in. Yeah.
Yeah. So there, well, obviously Aristotle, Descartes, Hume, Kant, Husserl, Hobbes. I think early modern is probably my favorite period in philosophy.
Yeah, I like the early moderns too.
They were great. They're doing intelligible work and making loads of progress. Like, how can this happen? I was really surprised the first time I read them. It's like, oh yeah, finally. I do love the dispute between Hume and Kant. I find this super interesting. Super interesting. I'm really interested in metaphysics. I find that period very, very, very fruitful and interesting. And more recently, of course, I would have to mention Tarski here and Will, but these are more like logicians that work very, very smart and did many interesting things. And recent philosophers who are still alive and all that is, yeah. I guess I would mention Crispin Wright, Hartree-Field. I could mention Williamson, but it would be usually just to antagonize the things that I find most interesting, but not always. So I think I should mention him. Yeah, I think that's my main list.
Yeah, I guess I should say that there are some philosophy students in NUS who are interested in metaphysics, but we are few and far between. So yeah.
I'm aware. I know that some people took my metaphysics course with Dan Waxman and enjoyed it, but most people, I could see in their faces, they were like, why are they arguing about these stupid things? Why? What's the purpose of this? And I cannot really blame them, because we all have an area of philosophy that makes us roll our eyes. For me, it's definitely not metaphysics, even though I feel that it should make me roll my eyes, but it doesn't. It just, I'm really interested. I think there's something interesting there. So hopefully some students, maybe after I teach my course in advanced math, Phil of Maths, maybe some of these people are interested in. Let's see what happens.
All right. Yeah, so I think the next question I have prepared. So it seems that your main research interests lie in this very formal domain, perhaps what Russell would call mathematical philosophy. So could you elaborate on what this form of philosophy is, and or perhaps your method or your way of doing this kind of philosophy?
Yeah, I don't think I have an answer to this. Okay, so I have an idea of what mathematical philosophy is, or perhaps this is an explication of mathematical philosophy, but I don't think that it does justice to the term mathematical philosophy. and so it's debatable whether it's really an exploitation of that term. But my idea is that mathematical philosophy is just analytic philosophy on steroids. It's just take analytic philosophy and think that it's vague, ambiguous, and sloppy, and make it even more precise. And of course, how to make things precise? Well, usually we use logic, right? If we detect some ambiguity here and there, we go for a new term. If we think the ambiguity might be coming from the grammatical structure of the statements involved in arguments regarding the issue, then we might want to formalize. And then we also will demand of our arguments are logically valid, which means that all premises have to be made explicit. And so now we are in the domain of logic somehow, right? And by making all premises explicit, sometimes we need to bring in some elements from mathematics, but this is not always the case. But of course, so I would think that any kind of philosophy that does what I just described is formal philosophy. I don't think it has to really apply a very complicated theory in mathematics to be called mathematical formal philosophy. But of course, sometimes that does happen because it allows us to be more precise. So for instance, let's take this example regarding possible world semantics. It was a language that the model languages with modalities for necessity and possibility were hard to understand somehow, right? And the idea was to bring in these new entities that would allow us to make sense of these languages. And it turned out that these entities could allow us to make sense of many other things, right? And these entities have somehow logical mathematical properties. And so studying them has become, well, the study of them has become a very interesting tool to do philosophy in general. And this looks like mathematics sometimes, so it can be very formal. If you look at papers from the 70s by Kripke, for instance, or Fine, Pryor, and so on. And that is true, but from my point of view, this was not necessary at all. And I don't think we really gained that much by introducing these new entities. And I think mathematical philosophy, when it's not just the type of formal philosophy I described first, but just the introduction of numbers or entities that behave mathematically here and there, then when it's this other thing, then usually it's not clear. It doesn't make anything clear. It just muddies the waters big time. And some people refer to this thing as mathematical philosophy. And I understand why some people then regard mathematical philosophy as a bunch of a waste of time. Yeah. And that's a shame. So I would prefer to stick to my characterization if that's acceptable.
Yes, of course. No, I'm just reminded of this thing Kant said in, I think it was the preface for the critique, where he said that like clarity of every part might not help in clarity of the whole. You know, when you and he was saying that to justify why the critique was so short.
Right. I don't remember that, but it's certainly true, and it certainly applies to him. If you read, I think if you read at least the first bits of the critique, bit by bit, they do make sense, but connecting them is actually a bit hard.
Yeah. I guess
yeah, I agree.
On analytic philosophy. I think Eldrick actually wanted to ask this question, but we skipped it. So I think he wanted to follow up on why you suggested that Wittgenstein, while leaving blanks in his big picture, is not analytic philosophy.
Well, because I think, I mean, it might be a matter of degree, right? As I said, formal philosophy is to me analytic philosophy on steroids, which means that analytic philosophy in general is usually, it can be a bit more sloppy and more hand-wavy than formal philosophy. And I think Wittgenstein was on that side of the spectrum, right? On the most hand-wavy end. And the whole point of analytic philosophy is that we can refute or prove something that we say, some things that we're saying. But if one is vague enough, then this cannot happen properly. And when one is vague, this is because, of course, one can always say, no, I didn't mean that. Or it's very hard for somebody else to come and argue against our view if we are particularly hand-wavy and vague. And I think Wittgenstein, he is an analytic philosopher to some extent, but he walks a lot on the edge of analytic and continental philosophy. And this is because he's very hand-wavy, and this is what I meant by blanks. I mean, I don't know much about Wittgenstein. I read Wittgenstein, doesn't mean I understood Wittgenstein, right? I don't want to get into Wittgenstein. I'm scared.
Actually, I'd like to jump in here for a while. Eugene. not as a defense, but because I mean, I've read a bit of Wittgenstein, and sometimes I don't understand him, and I just want to give up as well. But I guess I was interested in that follow-up question because I'm glad you mentioned, I guess, like continental philosophy as well, because I saw this quote on Twitter. I think someone tweeted, he said, like, analytic philosophy will not let a good argument get in the way of will not let a good idea get in the way of a good argument, whereas continental philosophy does not let a good argument get in the way of a good idea. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts on that. And yeah, because you mentioned Husserl also, right, as one of your philosophers that you find interesting, who is commonly placed in the continental side of the tradition. Yeah.
I agree. I must say I agree, and I sometimes hate analytic philosophy for that. I want to say something. I have an idea. This idea is new. It helped me personally understand something, a new domain, or an old problem that I was wondering about for such a long time, and many other people are working on. But I cannot write that up. I cannot just write a paper about that idea. And the reason is roughly that idea is not precise enough to be part of the analytic philosophy corpus. And one of my feelings towards the situation is, yeah, there's something wrong with philosophy if I cannot write this idea and publish it. But then I realized, no, I mean, the reason why I cannot do it is because the idea is not good enough. It's not precise enough. And then that's basically the starting point of the paper when I start working on something more serious, try to make precise this original idea I had that seemed nice but hard to pin down. And so, for instance, at the moment I'm working on a paper on logical consequence and Pelagianism that started like that. It started with an idea that was very vague, and I tried to communicate it to my fellow philosophers, colleagues here and there. And I think people didn't really get what I was saying for a while because the idea sounded good to me because I had other things filling out the gaps that I was not aware of, right? But for them, those fillers were not there. And therefore the idea was not good enough to be published, period. It took me a lot of time. It took me about 3 years, or maybe 4, to fill out those gaps. and make the idea more precise. Is it equally interesting? It's less interesting. I agree. But I think that the idea made more precise can still inspire the vague, ambiguous, kind of like hand-wavy idea I had at the beginning. People will get the bigger picture once they read a paper in which the idea is made more precise. I believe. Whereas Continental philosophers probably skip this really annoying part of trying to precisify an interesting kind of like mysterious idea. I don't want to be lynched, so I don't want to talk anymore about this.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the answer. It's pretty interesting. So I guess now we'll move on to another question related to another, I guess, field of research within analytic philosophy, which is the truth program. So like the theory of truth program, and in particular about deflationary theory of truth. So as far as we understood it, or I understood it, the deflationary theory of truth is sort of like a doctrine or a theory that there's nothing conceptually substantive about truth, either metaphysically speaking or epistemologically speaking. And truth is, as it were, just merely a syntactic predicate. So I guess it sounds quite fascinating, but I've always wondered, like, how does this account of truth sort of coheres with truth's ability to sort of play like a causal explanatory role?
Yeah, I think it just says that truth does not play that role, period. A way of understanding deflationism is to understand this function that truth, as you said, as a syntactic device is playing. And perhaps it's too much for an interview like this, but we can draw a parallel with conjunction, for instance. So conjunction is just a stupid term that puts things together, right? So imagine you have like two things to say, two premises, 1 and 2, right? And you believe these things to be maybe true, maybe false, you don't know, but you're entertaining two propositions expressed by two claims, 1 and 2, right? Suddenly you realize that you want to say that if those two things put together took place somehow, then something else would happen. To utter that new sentence, you need to use conjunction, right? So conjunction is not dispensable. You need to use it to say, for instance, if 1 and 2, then 3, for instance. Otherwise, you cannot formulate that conditional. So you can live without conjunction if you want to convey 1 and 2, because you can say, we can simply utter 1 and then immediately afterwards utter 2. But if you want, for instance, to express a conditional that says if 1 and 2 hold, then 3 holds, then you need conjunction, right? The truth predicate does a similar job, basically, a very similar job. Actually, you could use the truth predicate to say this. You can say that if 1 and 2 are true, then 3.
Sorry, this is like a little trivial, but well, if you accept import-export, couldn't you just say if 1, then if 2, then 3?
Yes. Yes.
So I wonder, I mean, this is trivial, right? Because it still doesn't get around the whole, I mean, it doesn't mean that we can now dispense with the idea of conjunction, but yeah,
no, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, but you can also dispense. You can also just use disjunction negation. But I would say there is a conjunction there somehow. But even if let's assume that there is no import or export. It's just an example. Yeah, I agree. Actually, we might be able to dispense with conjunction if we have the conditional negation and other things. Totally correct. But the truth predicate is not dispensable in a sense. It's because, so imagine that instead of 1 and 2 there, you have infinitely many claims, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. Then you cannot have an infinite conjunction there, because we cannot write down, you cannot utter an infinite conjunction. It takes infinite time. It's something we cannot do. And also we cannot utter this infinite embedding of conditionals, right? Either. So how do we do it? Well, we say all claims numbers with positive integer are true. And if that's the case, so if all these claims are true, then something else follows. So we can embed infinitely many claims in the antecedent of a conditional using a truth predicate. We cannot do that with conditional alone or with a conjunction or anything. This is just one example of what truth can do for you. It's not that it just allows us to utter conditionals with infinitely many things in the antecedent, but it does that, and that's a very important thing. Now, in general, what it did first, so we can embed all those infinitely many things in the conditional, was it collected infinitely many claims for us in a single claim, right? So it worked effectively as an infinite conjunction, but in a finite way, right? So infinite conjunctions live in a language we cannot speak. Truth lives in a language that we speak every day, actually. And so what truth is doing, if you wish, is roughly what infinite conjunctions would do if we could speak that language. It's not exactly like that. I have papers suggesting actually that this is not the case, but I think it's a good point to start from. Now, if we think about it this way, then every time we propose an explanation of something, or that involves truth, or every time we utter a philosophical principle that in which the truth predicate occurs, then what the deflationist needs to show is that that predicate is actually playing this kind of role and not another role. And this is exactly what I would claim as a deflationist. I would say, well, look, for instance, you can talk about the factivity of knowledge as only truths are knowable. And you think, oh, that truth predicate there is playing an explanatory role, explanatory of knowledge. Or the goal of science is to find the truth. Again, same thing. You might think it's a substantial philosophical thesis. And I agree they are substantial philosophical theses. My point here is that the truth predicate there is playing an infinite conjunction role, we can call it that for now, and nothing more. And so it would be a mistake to think that the occurrence of the truth predicate and explanatory principles like that means that the predicate itself plays an explanatory role. And let me explain why. So imagine that, so to express the factivity of knowledge, for instance, something like only truths are knowable, we could also use a slightly different formulation, and we could say it's not the case that something is knowable but not true, right? So there we have negation and conjunction involved in that principle. Does that mean that negation and conjunction play an explanatory role? Well, they are occurring in an explanatory principle, so they should, in a way. I don't think that's correct. I don't think that's the right way of thinking. They are expressing, they're allowing us to put our thoughts together, to connect thoughts in different ways, right? This is why they're connectives. But they're not part of the content, so to speak. They allow us to structure the content. Of course, this is very, very hand-wavy, and I cannot, this is one of the ideas I cannot write. They're allowing us to structure the content, but they're not part of the content. And deflationists think of truth exactly that way. So what is the truth predicate in only truths are knowable doing? Well, basically, it's allowing us to generalize a schema of the form, if phi is knowable, then phi. So the content of the activity of knowledge is, if you wish, the content of all the instances of this schema, of this schematic principle. If phi is knowable, then phi. How can we collect all these instances together? Well, we just say this for every phi, right? For every phi, phi is knowable, then phi. That's ungrammatical. And so then, how do you solve it? You bring in a truth predicate. And then you say, well, for every phi, if phi is knowable, then phi is true. And similar considerations apply to other principles involving truth in philosophy, such as the goal of science is to find out the truths, or things like that. I don't know if this is clear, but in a nutshell, what I'm trying to say is that the truth predicate allows us to structure and connect contents rather than create content. And in this sense, it's not substantial or representational. It's more like a syntactic device. Does this make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I will admit that, like, I'm not completely, it's not absolutely crystal clear to me, but I think what you said makes sense. Yeah. I just need to
well, I think that's good enough. Understanding deflationism is proved to be quite difficult. I think it's not a simple thesis. It will take some time. I think I'm still understanding bits of it, and I've been working on it for such a long time.
Actually, yeah, I guess I was very interested in these because, like you say, it's very difficult to understand. I'm sure you're being modest in saying that you're still understanding it, but I think I just have like a follow-up to what you said, and because I'm always wondering, I mean, philosophy is relatively abstract or pure, as you mentioned at the start, right? But like the whole idea of the whole deflationist program, I mean, if you were to sort of come down from the Platonic realm and then go into the real world, and we're talking about issues like fake news and things like that, like, oh, Donald Trump said this and it's true, or Donald Trump said P and P is true, and in comes the deflationist or the analytic philosopher deflationist and say that all you're saying is just Donald Trump said this or Donald Trump said P, and I'm not sure if I can sort of express what I want to say properly, but it just strikes me that the deflationists, like, given deflationism, right, the way they see truth, it doesn't quite allow us to adjudicate things within, say, I don't know, in politics when it comes to issues like fake news and stuff. So am I getting a sense, right, that deflationist is merely targeting semantic syntax, but they're not seeing anything about what it does when it comes to speaking in, say, natural language or this discourse natural language? Yeah.
Yes, this is correct. This is exactly right. Deflationism is not trying to tell philosophers what it takes for some particular sentences to be true. It's not asking that question. There's a good paper by Walker, I think it's from 1980. It's in this collection by Lynch on the nature of truth. This is an excellent paper. What this guy is arguing is, look, deflationism has no beef with the correspondence theory of truth, really, or with, or at least with versions of the correspondence theory of truth, or with more pragmatic views on truth, or with idealism, things like that. In any case, if you think that, I mean, in general with realism, so if you think that for something to be true, what needs to happen is that something corresponds somehow with the world. So for a sentence, for instance, let's say we are talking about truth of sentences or propositions. Let's say proposition. So for a proposition to be true, what needs to happen is that it corresponds with reality. So in reality, then this needs to be happening, basically. Then, of course, the question I would be asking is, okay, let's think about an example first. Let's think about snow is white. Is the proposition that snow is white true? Well, only if I go to the world to look at snow, and if effectively snow is white, then the proposition that snow is white is true. And if not, no, right? Okay, great. So then we'll have that if really snow is white, then the proposition that snow is white is true. And of course, snow is white, right? It will never happen, if you're a realist, that the proposition that snow is white is true, but snow is not white. And then you think, oh, okay, so what's the difference between, or vice versa, right? That will never happen. So what's the difference between deflationism and this realist view on truth, correspondence view on truth? They both accept that P is true if and only P. Just that deflationism remains silent about whether we should go to the world or not to find out whether P if and only if true P. That is all deflationism is saying, because that is all it takes for the truth predicate to play the function I was talking about before, to allow us to collect infinitely many things into one sentence. Now, the realist doesn't contradict that. Doesn't say, no, sometimes true P, but not P. No, they don't say that. But they are interested in another thing, which is completely besides the point for deflationists, and not bad, but like different philosophical question, which is when P. When P and true P, of course. When I ask the question for P, I ask the question for true P thereby. And my question is when P. So they're asking questions about truth and the extension of truth and how to basically determine the extension of truth rather than the functioning of the truth predicate. And this is exactly what I think you had in mind. And it turns out that if you look at an idealist view of truth or a pragmatist view of truth, they're doing the same. None of them is going to say, well, yes, snow is white, but it's not true that snow is white. I mean, not at all. They're all going to say, they're all trying to find, for instance, pragmatists are trying to find ways of determining whether P and true P at the same time. And that is going to depend on what's convenient or not, right? Or what's going to be, what's going to happen with the future of humanity and the scientific enterprise, epistemological enterprise. And the idealists are doing the same. They're also not going to deny the T schema and this equivalence. They're just going to say, well, P, if P coheres with a certain body of beliefs, and of course this is also true of P, right? It's just that they're using the truth predicate in a generalizing way, as the deflationist is suggesting. They're just using the truth predicate to formulate the goal of their inquiry, to find out when P for each P, or what it would take for P for each P. This is ungrammatical, so let me reformulate. What they're trying to find out what it would take for each P, what it would take for P to be true for each P. And so this is how they're using the truth predicate to formulate the problem they want to focus on. But the problem they want to focus on is one about the nature of reality and the extension of truth, rather than the nature of truth as a predicate, as a linguistic device in a language. Does this make sense?
Yeah, thank you. We promised to torture you with one last philosophical question before we end it off with a more personal question, since it's almost an hour and we don't take up too much time. But the last philosophical question would be, I guess since the time of the Greeks, like Socrates, philosophy has always been touted as the sort of like truth-seeking enterprise. But then, as we were just discussing, there are, in some ways, various theories of truth, and people have different conceptions of truth. So it seems, yeah, just what are your thoughts on this statement that philosophy is a truth-seeking enterprise? That are we really seeking the truth when we are doing philosophy, or can there be something else?
I think they're really seeking the truth. Or, I mean, of course, some particular people might be doing something else, maybe trying to get published and get tenure and things like that. But philosophy as a discipline, I think, is trying to get to the truth. What philosophers want is to find out whether P for each P. And that means that they want to say something like, well, if philosophy decides that P, they want the following. They want that philosophy decides that P if and only if P. For every P. So philosophy wants to decide P if and only if P is true. And that means you might be like, no, of course not. Philosophy is not interested in every single proposition. That might be true. So philosophy might have somehow, it might be not be maybe so topic neutral as we make it seem. I don't know, honestly. But I think regardless of the topic, philosophy does try to find out the truth. And this might take the form of a counterexample. We try to find general principles that explain reality somehow, and sometimes most of the times philosophy cannot find principles like that, but what they can find is counterexamples to principles, to alleged principles that would explain reality, and so on. And this is something that philosophy has been really good at, finding counterexamples to general principles. And those are true, right? The counterexample just shows that the general principle is not true, so the negation of the general principle is something that philosophy can proudly utter as one of its findings. Or maybe you had something else in mind with this question.
No, it's just because me and Eugene often discuss about this notion, and yeah, it's a very interesting.
What do you think? Do you think philosophy does aim at the truth?
Yes.
I do to some extent, but depends on.
But what are the other options?
I don't know. I think it's gonna sound very cliche, but sort of sometimes for me, I find philosophy is a way of understanding the human condition, and a lot of times the human condition is somewhat complex. So perhaps philosophy doesn't get at the truth per se, but it helps us sort of mediate the world, mediate between ourselves and the world. And I mean, just to take an example of metaphysics, I think I took your metaphysics course 2 sems ago, and I really, really liked it. And I was blown away by Carnap's idea of conceptual frameworks that he wrote in Empiricism, Semantics, Ontology. And I've just been really a Carnapian since then, and I really love his idea. So I think I don't think metaphysics is useless per se, but insofar if you try to answer metaphysical questions as a factual external question, I think that's misguided. I mean, you can try and do that, but I think it's misguided. But I think if you try and get at what is the best conceptual framework to sort of carve the world, then I think that's fine. You know, like you have your certain pragmatic considerations, you go by them, and then you try to come with a certain framework or representation. I think that's fine. But insofar as you try to get at it as a factual external question, as Carnap would put it, I think that's somewhat misguided for me. Yeah.
That is a good view on ontology, right? Or on metaphysics or meta-metaphysical view. And it could be wrong. So Carnap is uttering something. He is refusing to have an argument about many bits of philosophy, including whether properties exist or numbers exist and so on. But he is writing a paper on meta-metaphysics, so he is willing to discuss some things regarding metaphysics, and those are whether there is a meaningful question about the existence of abstract objects independently of a particular framework, for instance. This is philosophy. And this is, I think, Carnap was trying to, Carnap was uttering propositions that were not just opinions, right? In the sense that they were not, they were opinions, but he was uttering propositions that he thought to be true. This nonsensical idea of, right, of discussing whether numbers exist is not just a feeling, right? He actually thinks that it is nonsensical. That means that he could be wrong. So then the discussion, the pursuit of truth just happens at a meta level, so to speak. But yeah, of course, in this case, it leaves a lot of philosophy in a state of, in an aimless state when it comes to truth, or it gives a lot of philosophical discussions a different aim, which is usefulness aim, right? But then at the meta level, there is all the discussion about true principles that's still there, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think Carnap is true. So what he said was true. So definitely, yeah, I'd like to I'd like to push the question a bit, but I also don't want to take up too much time. So I guess we'll end with a few questions just to end this interview off. Eugene, you have anything before we do that?
No, I'm good.
Okay, yeah. So okay, so the last two questions would be, the first one is, what would you have done if not for philosophy, or if not as a philosopher?
I'm not sure how to understand this question. You mean, so when I was deciding what to do in my life, I was told I couldn't study philosophy. Or when I was deciding to pursue a PhD, I was told I couldn't. Or when I was deciding to try to find a job in philosophy, I was told I was not going to get one. Or now, what I would do if philosophy wasn't an option anymore, or if I didn't want to do philosophy anymore. All of these questions have different answers. But I think the most interesting one is probably the one about me now, or not. You tell me what do you think is the most interesting question?
I guess maybe I should phrase it in ideally, or in another possible world, what would you have wanted to do?
Another possible world, but I think it's relevant that. So, for instance, I think that one of the things I would have done if I hadn't done philosophy when I was a student is study mathematics. I did study mathematics. I was thinking about becoming a mathematician at some point. Then I decided not to. I thought I would not be a good mathematician because I was not smart enough to prove all these weird theorems. And also, most importantly, not interested enough in proving these theorems that were quite meaningless to me. And I cared more about what I used to call the more fundamental questions, which were philosophical questions. But if I hadn't done philosophy, I would probably stuck to maths. Now, I guess to that, I would have to answer that. Now, I would have regretted it, I think. I wouldn't be happy with that decision now. So what I would have liked to do with my life is something very different from these things. It's probably something like evolutionary biology or things like that. Or maybe I would have liked to be a chef. Or things like that, in that ballpark. But I think that at each point in my life, the alternative was different. And had I dropped out, at the beginning, I would have done one thing, and if I drop out now, I would do another thing. I don't think I had only two loves in my life, and one was philosophy, and the other one was evolutionary biology or something like that.
Right. Yeah. Seems. Yeah. All right. Okay. So the last question is, if you were stranded on an island, which 3 books would you take with you?
Right. Yeah. Probably this is not the answer you want, but I would take a book on basic survival. A book about how to build weapons, probably, and tools from scratch. And probably a book on how to build houses from scratch. Assuming the island has stones or wood or something like that.
Okay. Sorry. Maybe let's assume you know all of these. Like I don't know. Who's that? Mark Twain or Robinson Crusoe, and you're able to do all this just like a priori.
That's a very, very difficult question. I think probably I would take Karamazov Brothers by Dostoevsky, Count of Monte Cristo by Dumas, and maybe something by Sartre. I don't know. I honestly, this is a very difficult question for me. Because what I'm thinking is, what can I read again and again and get something more out of? And I'm not even sure about Count of Monte Cristo. Like it's a rather simple story. Whereas Karamazov Brothers is more interesting. So maybe I would go with War and Peace by Tolstoy instead. Yeah, maybe that.
Yeah, sounds nice. Very nice. Yeah. So yeah, once again, thank you very much, Prof. Lavinia, for joining us today. And it was a very, very nice interview. And yeah, I guess we can end it off here. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.